Welcome everyone to the program today. Mondo Gonzales here in studio, and I have through the internet, which is wonderful, our good friend Graham Keelan, all the way from Bristol, England. Graham, welcome.
Hey, Mondo. Good to join you again.
Yes, and it's been good. It's been a while since we had a chance to really chat, and there's so much happening now over the last really couple months since Trump has come into the administration, no doubt, in his own way, a wrecking ball uh, in so many things. But also, I think some things need to be wrecked for sure. So I thought it would have been great to hear your perspective on things coming from, again, the UK. Let's kind of jump right in because there's so much to discuss from your perspective here. Just looking at some of my notes, it seems that the relationship between America and Europe and even maybe NATO in general, it's is it well, let me just ask you, is it weakened? Is it fracturing? Is it breaking apart? I've seen that no doubt what Trump has done, a couple things, has pushed some of the European nations to increase their own funding for their own European army. I mean, is Trump, whether he knows it or not, contributing to the development of a European army, which might be the Beast Army? I mean, kind of jump in on all of that from your perspective, being right there in the midst of it.
Yeah, well, we're having this conversation, Mondo, on Liberation Day, President Trump's declaration of Liberation Day for the US, and the markets are tanked, so I can see. And also, Marco Rubio is in the NATO headquarters, laying down the law, as it were, for the new American attitude towards the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization. Yeah, I think. Well, is it fracturing? Listen, there are a lot of shrill voices here over in the European arena, and I think. Well, there's that thing about there's a new sheriff in town, isn't there? And it's more that the old assumptions now have gone in terms of American involvement in NATO, and simply because. So you look at it from both points of view. So from the American point of view, of course, you've been carrying NATO, and with your massive expense, your expenditure. I mean, you are now like coming up to 40 trillion in debt, something like that, the national debt, and quite frankly, the Americans can no longer afford to carry the bulk of certainly of European security. And so they're saying, hey, look, it's time for you to stump up. Interestingly, reading about this has been going on since Eisenhower. The Americans have been trying to get the Europeans to cough up all the way since the 50s, right? And so, obviously out of World War II, they got the Cold War. Europe was decimated during World War II, so it relied very much on heavily on American, the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of the continent, and also then the security of Western Europe at the time. But of course, the Berlin Wall came down. Was it 89? Was it 90? I'm forgetting that. But and then from that, NATO sort of began its glorious expansion eastward, even though apparently the Russians were promised that wouldn't happen. But anyway, here we are. So now what's 32 nations, 31 nations. And what's really interesting is that, I can get it from the Americans' point of view, because the Europeans have have used American largesse to literally build these incredibly intricate and expensive welfare states. When you sort of you look at NATO spending, European spending, I think at the time of the Cold War, I think we were spending nearly 5% or something on defense. Well, that kind of plummeted over the years to about 2%, just really fulfilling our NATO obligations because we were the joint founders of NATO with the US. So from that, of course, I mean, we've hollowed out our armed forces to where we now have the lowest standing army since Napoleon. Can you believe it, right? So we've now only got just about 70,000 soldiers in the field and 150,000 total personnel. And we've got one of the largest European armies. Or we are actually the greatest European nation using that or category of defense spending. We are it. Not in terms of GDP now, because Poland now is really upping its spending, but in terms of, I think, 58 billion pounds, nearly 60 billion pounds. But we spent 100 billion on our interest payments alone. So we spend more on our interest payments than we do on defense, education, and justice combined.
What is your national debt?
Our national debt, I think, is about 1.2 trillion. It's almost 100% of GDP.
Wow.
Almost 100%, not quite. So again, but all of these economies are imploding now. All our Western economies. So obviously, what's happened is that the Americans have said, sorry, the game's up, and rightfully so, because now. And what's truly ironic for me here living in England is that it's a Labour government, a socialist government, who introduced the welfare state back in 1949. That now sort of have the responsibility to tell the British people that the game is up. So that's an interesting thing to watch, because this present government apparently is they had the great socialist agenda, and now it's all that's completely in ruins. So now we're having to increase our defense spending. We raided the foreign aid budget, so 2.7, going up to 3% in 2029. That's the May. But of course, Marco Rubio has told the NATO that Europeans now have to sort of get their spending up to 5%. So this
deadline, was there a deadline on that, or any?
No. They say no. They say we realize it's not going to happen, next year, but there has to be a credible path. So now our government is cutting welfare payments, welfare budgets, and so because now they have to find the money to spend it on defence. And of course, we now have the tariff war going on. So it really. And of course, from the European point of view, so they're getting a little bit, America's not being, it's unreliable. We can't rely on America anymore for our defense. We have to, we have to now buy European. So of course, someone like President Macron is seeing this as a great opportunity, right, to bolster European defense. The defense industry. There is a need, I think, for European defense industry, because one of the things Europeans are pointing out to the Americans is, well, hey, we buy 4 times more from America for our defense than we do from Europe. So if you're going to be so unreliable, we're now going to build up our own European defense industries. And there are big ones, BAE Systems here, you've got Thales in France, Leonardo in Italy. So there's that sort of dynamic going on with what's going on. But yeah, it's kind of, but you know what, they should have known this, because Trump was like this the first time round. Mm-hmm. And now it's like, well, okay, you want, but the Europeans don't trust Putin at all, and I don't think anybody should. Mm-hmm. Their thing is he will come for more. At some stage, he will come for more. And so now the Europeans have to catch up, and they have to catch up quickly to bridge the American gap in terms of armaments, or what the Europeans are capable of, what the gaps that they fill. There's all talk of the nuclear, the umbrella, will that be removed? But apparently President Trump's, reaffirmed his commitment to NATO, but he's told the Europeans, pay up now. It's really, and now the Europeans are actually going to their people and saying, okay, the welfare game is over. It's interesting, Mondo. I look at the history of this nation. Let me just boast on us a little bit here. we invented virtually everything, you know, and it's kind of, I like to say to people, you got a radio, you're welcome. You got a telephone, you're welcome. You got a television, you're welcome. You got a computer, you're welcome. You got, you know, even the World Wide Web, right? We created that and gave it to the world for free. I don't know whether that's a good idea now. I think we should have put a bar on it, you know, to say that if you're going to have a website, you at least you have to have read a book or something from start to finish. But anyway, you're flying around in a jet engine, you're welcome, you know. It's kind of, and when I look at us now, I mean, do you know, I don't know if, well, let me just say this. We have actually won more Nobel Prizes per capita than any other nation on earth. So America's won more Nobel Prizes, obviously. Per capita. I mean, we're the most inventive nation in the history of the world. I say that with no apology. The electric motor, right? And like the 1900s is when the Nobel Prize came in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what about all the invention that was before that? You know, the height of the British Empire, the height of British industry. An electric motor, it powers everything. You know, Michael Faraday, you're welcome. Mm-hmm. Electromagnetism, Maxwell, you're welcome. You know, all of that. And I was reading a report today. So we have, Mondo, 1 in 4 young people are not in education, employment, or training in this country. They're all signed off on benefits because they all have mental health problems. 1 in 4 young people, right? I read a report today. There's a young lady. She earns £500,000 a year as a benefit influencer, right? In other words, she has 1 million followers. She's influencing people. She's kind of telling people how to milk the welfare system, the welfare state, right? This is her ambition. She says, I have no ambition to get a job. She's 31.
This is her job.
This is her job. How to milk the system. And you have 1 million people following her, trying to find out how to milk the system. So this part, you know, how has the mighty fallen, right? How has the mighty fallen? I like I say, I boast about this nation for what we have achieved. In the centuries past, to what we have now become, and what, you know, the generation that is now coming forth is more interested. The younger people are more interested in being influencers or being welfare recipients than being drivers of industry, by being inventors. You know what I mean? The great mantle that rests upon this nation of invention. So anyway, that's my little boast about this country. But that's kind of where we sort of, in terms of where the Europeans now realize they've now really got to catch up, because the Americans are saying, sorry, we can't afford it. You want to keep the Russians at bay, you want to keep Putin out, then you're going to have to, stump up the money and change so Europe somehow is going to have to move from a welfare state system to, Germany now is talking about conscription. Poland now wants to have massive conscription. Germany wants to reintroduce conscription. They're amending their constitution. The money that is being bandied about, the European Union, they're going to, I think, 125 billion euros that they're raising for European defence. But that's in addition to Germany's already spent an additional 80 billion that is put to its defence. So there's a lot of money involved here.
Yeah.
And so I think it's going to rejuvenate European industry, certainly the defence industry. So, that's kind of, but just to get back to that thing about the Americans are unreliable, I say, well, from the American point of view, Europe's been unreliable since the time of Eisenhower.
Yeah,
an unreliable ally.
This is a good opportunity to share with the audience that we're going to be coming back to Europe, Europe 3.0, and that'll be with Billy Crone and Ken Michael, myself, Josh Schwartz, and maybe a couple others. But that's going to be August 30th, and then we'll be in Oxford, England, and then we're going to be heading over to Norway after that, and then Germany. And so people can get information about that, prophecywatchers.com, and just go to the events tab. scroll down and you can see the specific details. So we're going to be there. I mean, when you let's kind of wrap this in a little bow here, and this at least thoughts on it. All the things that are happening now, let's say in the past couple months, under Trump, and maybe even a little bit under his first administration, how does this contribute? And nobody's a prophet necessarily in that sense, but how does this contribute to the overall end time scenario as it relates to Europe? I think if we think, and not everybody agrees, but if we just assume for a moment that the revived Roman Empire, of Daniel chapter 2, is going to be Europe central, Mediterranean based, so to speak, like the original Roman Empire was, and no doubt Europe's going to be involved in this. How do you think this is contributing? Because there's two things here. One is, as you mentioned, you have all these nation states that are approaching things that themselves through their own GDP, like you said, Poland and others. But then you have the European Union itself, which is in one sense a separate entity, or at least a transcendent entity, managing their own level of expenditures. And then you have another transcendent is NATO. So is this going to, within 5 years, let's say, is Europe going to be potentially a powerhouse, which will then contribute to the coming, center of the beast system? I mean, what's your thoughts on that? How do you think it through?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought that much through on that one. I think, look, the world is heading for war, right? So it's on the road to war. We know that. There will come a time where people say peace, peace. But I think Europe is going to have to completely change its outlook, and for that, it's going to have to tell its citizens that like I say, the party's over.
Gravy train's over. Yeah,
the gravy train is over. So we're going to have to begin to fund our own defense. I mean, if you want to make some money now, I suppose putting some money into European defense industries, Rolls-Royce or BAE Systems. I'm not advising that. I'm looking at how all the stocks are rising on these defense industries. So I think certainly that is going to increase. Where it's going to end up in, they actually said that for the Europeans, or even like for the UK, to sort of to plug the gaps that the Americans provide for its defense capabilities, it's going to take 10 years.
10 years.
Yeah, forget 5% for 10 years. So of course, so to do that, it's not like a time of war. You're restructuring your economy, right, in this preparation for war. So it's going to be interesting, Mondo, to see how that plays out, and different European partners in terms of how they see it. There was talk of the Americans sort of abrogating their commander NATO, because they've always had the supreme allied commander, and then the deputy is usually always gone to a British commander. That's just how it's always worked out. But there was talk, I don't know what is happening, but there was talk that the Americans would say, okay, we're not going to have the allied supreme commander. And if that ever happens, that really is a case of America saying, you've got to do this yourself, because we're concentrating on China, and there's a lot of stuff going on, isn't there? Across the world, and it's like countries like Australia. So the Chinese Navy just did a circuit of Australia. So the Australians are now saying, well, what have we got to do as a Western nation to sort of protect ourselves against Chinese aggression? So there's massive amounts of things going on. And of course, will the Iranians, will Iran be struck with their nuclear sites? Who knows? Apparently, I read today the Houthis, the Iranians have abandoned the Houthis now because the game is up for them. So just a lot going on, Mondo. And I think it would be a bit foolish to try and predict what is actually, what's going to be, the outcome of all this, other than I think, we just have to be aware that the end is upon us.
Yeah. I mean, we saw we saw the Jelani of Syria, the new HST president. He's going to be meeting with Trump in Saudi Arabia, and so that's a big deal. And in one sense, and then of course, for those that have been watching, for 20, 30 years, when you see aircraft carrier group after aircraft carrier group making their way across the world to the Middle East, that's not done just to waste gasoline or fuel or nuclear energy or whatever. And then we've seen 7, B-2 bombers, as a B-1 Lancer bomber heading over to Diego Garcia. You guys own that island. And
well, at the moment, we've signed it off. Apparently, Trump has said, yeah, you can give it away. You can give it back to Mauritius, and we go to pay Mauritius nine, and it's up front £9 million a year. We don't have the money for that. We've got to pay Mauritius to give the island because apparently it belongs to them, because the UN court has decided, the International Court of Justice decided it belongs to them. Which was a judged by a Chinese official. Can you imagine a Chinese official? But of course, our Prime Minister is very much is a lawyer, so there's the accusation that that they're more in tune with dealing with looking good on the international stage than actual strategic interest, that sort of thing. Perfect. Anyway, but yes, so it's. Yeah, another thing to go on.
Yeah, so we have this buildup that's happening right now in front of our eyes, and Trump has been, I'll say it this way: what we know about Trump is that when he says something, a lot of times it can be inflammatory or it's meant to stir the pot, and that's all true. But also, he does follow through on what he says, and so he said basically to Iran, it's either you're going to give it up. You're going to give up your nuclear thing, or we're going to bomb you. So that's it. I mean, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. New sheriff in town. And so, in fact, I think what you're seeing with the Iranians with the Houthis, same thing. We've been bombing the Houthis, I think justifiably so, because of their disruption of everybody there, total terrorism in the Straits. But I think Iran sees the writing on the wall. Like, wow, they're bombing them. They're building up. They cannot. And I saw this too in another article, that what Iran is worried about more than a United States attack is that would coincide with a domestic rebellion of an overthrow, because it hasn't been their real, their currency is the inflation is 40% in the past few months, and so. What they can't do is have instability, of course, with a U.S. attack. But what they were saying was that if you look at the surrounding countries, all these border skirmishes, they cannot handle all of that at once and then have an internal rebellion by the people. And so they are very, very nervous about their regime getting overthrown simply by the weight of all these things converging at once. So that's a big deal. We know they're liars, honestly, about their nuclear program. And as we've seen with the JCPOA, going all the way back to 2015. So, where's this heading? The next few months are going to be quite interesting, because one of the things that helps us is Trump also has given deadlines. Like, this is the deadline. Better have the answer by this. So thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think you have to be more than a prophet to prophesy about what's going on in the Middle East, right? Because it's so inflammatory. Will the Ayatollahs ever give up to Iran? I'm not sure that they ever would. So maybe what you're saying is correct, that maybe they are just they're cutting their losses with Hezbollah and all their proxies to look after at home. But you're aware the threat was, if the Americans come up to threaten to bomb the nuclear sites, then we will do a preemptive strike, bomb Diego Garcia, which then from the UK standpoint is actually that might not be a bad idea because the Russians there, they say we don't want the island anymore. So it's just, so yeah, it's a maze. I think the Middle East. I think we can only sort of look at that through a prophetic lens of where it's going, rather than saying, this is going to happen or that's going to happen. It's more, I think, as well, Mondo, about what's happening within our own civilization, and our Western civilization, because I think there's an interesting narrative going on there as well.
On that's a good segue, because help us understand, let me give just a brief comment here, in that in America, we have the Bill of Rights, we have the freedom of speech, freedom of religion enshrined, in the First Amendment, the freedom to gather peacefully. Those rights are only for citizens. Okay, so if you're a foreigner here and you have a visa, those aren't guaranteed for you at all. In fact, we reserve the right to kick you out if we don't like what you say. So, we don't have to respect. They don't come in with the same rights because they're not citizens. And so if they say these things, if they're pro-Hamas or anti-this, or it's just something we simply don't like, anti-American, we can revoke it, and that doesn't violate any of our freedoms or enshrined in the Constitution. So that's the case here. But in my own thinking as well, I've tended to think in terms of what you said, Western civilization, that, well, we got freedom of speech here. That's not just an American thing. That's a Western civilization thing, right? I mean, isn't that all Europe's that way? And so, which is wrong thinking. So, talk about what truly freedom of speech means for you in England or in the UK in general, and how that maybe contrasts with how it might be for us. Because I think we might assume that you guys have the same levels, but yet we're seeing people arrested for thinking and praying and and silently doing this, and we're like, what? Or making a post on Facebook, and we're like, whoa, help the American understand the differences.
Okay, well, let me just go back to some history, because I think there's always historical context is good. So I was listening to a prominent historian, and he this is just his field. And I think from an American, Western civilization is effectively English civilization. So all the concepts that, as an American, that you believe in, right? So limited government, representative government, independent judiciary, trial by jury, free markets, free press, freedom of worship, of assembly, freedom of speech, etc., right to protest, capitalism, all that began here. It's all this was the birthplace of all of that. So which is why some historians will say when that the American, let's say the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, the war there was actually England's second civil war or third civil war, depending how many what we have here. In other words, it was a continuation of British English ideas, particularly, which were fought out in the New World, right? The idea that the Englishman is a free person was the very fuel of the colonists, sort of their grievances, right? Because their rights as free Englishmen were being violated. Okay, so we are your mother, we are your father. So from that point of view, it's a continuation. What you have there in America is a continuation of these freedoms. But what we have seen certainly is a particular erosion. And now, of course, we've gone at this different ways in our nation. So we don't have a separation of powers like you do, but we have the balance of powers within our parliamentary system, right? So everything that a case in point that we can mention about what the Americans, the State Department, picked up on about this person who was caught praying within the exclusion zone of an abortion clinic. So that was a parliamentary motion passed. Some people felt it was too onerous. And then, of course, then there is this idea of, where does freedom of speech end? Where does it begin? Because we all put limits on freedom of speech. Mm-hmm. My nation, your nation, there has to be limits on freedom of speech. So that was a parliamentary bill that was passed. So the person who was doing that was effectively breaking the law. Now, some people can say the law is it wasn't a good law. And you do have the pro-life people who were kind of applauding the Americans for bringing this up, because here in the UK, because we're more secular, we don't have such a pro-life lobby like you do in the States, and so I don't think it would the abortion laws would never be overturned here. All we can expect, I think, best is for a reduction in the weeks of abortion. So that was kind of what's playing out there. So this person was in the 150-meter exclusion zone, right? So effectively, that's why the police were arrested, because they don't want to, people going to access healthcare, that's why they call it, don't want them to feel intimidated or feel, pressured or feel distressed or anything like that. Of course, the pro-life people, which I am one, would say, well, what about the young person in the womb? Do they not feel distressed by the actions you're going to take? So anyway, so this is kind of the balance, and some people thought the balance was too far, for the pro-choice camp, because we did have people protesting outside abortion clinics, etc., like what's going on in America. So there's that argument going on. There's the other argument about. I mean, we do have. I mean, it depends what side, of course, you're on, right? So the protests in London, like last year with Hamas and from the river to the sea, and the protest is full on there, right? There was an interesting case here about. Just happened a couple of days ago, Mondo, was the police raided a Quaker meeting house, to arrest a group of activists. Now, they weren't Quaker activists. They were in the Quaker house. But the police go into the place to arrest, and the activist, it's like a young people's activist group. And we have like the Stop Oil activists. Last year, who were bringing London to a standstill. And this is what they were planning to do again, was to bring London to a standstill. So we do have the right to protest and all of that. And so the police went in. And of course, now this has thrown up a whole constitutional problem about, well, the freedom of religion. It's in a place of religious. The Quakers are all up in arms about this. That's a bit of an oxymoron, because the Quakers are never up in arms, right? Right. Because they're peaceniks. So, you come into a place of worship that's never happened, etc. And so where do you draw the line? So some of us would say, well, hey, nip it in the bud. We don't want people blocking, stopping economic activity because of their activism. But then there's another incident, which is kind of like moved on to the other edge, where a couple, a husband and wife, disagreed with an appointment at a school, and they of the head. And they got into a bit of a slanging match on a WhatsApp group, and the school was saying they were being sort of intimidating, and they were being sowing disunity and what have you. And they approached the police, and the police said, "Well, here's what you should do." So they called the police to arrested them in front of their 6-year-old girl. Six cops turned up at the house. They were arrested for 11 hours, right? And eventually the cop says, there's nothing to answer here for. It should never have gone to the police. So the police advised the school to take this course in action to arrest. The police said, well, there was no case to answer for. It should never have gone to. So this is kind of but this is where we're at, I think, with free speech, because this is, the school thinks now this is the way you should deal with, difficult parents who are sort of. So
talk about who's intimidating who now.
Yeah, who's intimidating who? But I think as I thought about this, I think it's the internet which has really launched this dilemma of the free speech dilemma in our societies, because we're speaking before again about the I think it's the American administration now is revoking visas of students who are either pro-Palestine or pro-Hamas. So where's the freedom of speech there? So again, it's almost like how do you navigate this whole idea of freedom of speech? And you know, and of course, you know, what a lot of people, I mean, we get back to the idea of Western civilization. There's a lot of voices now, I think, I don't know if you agree with me on this, but there's a lot of voices now talking about, you know, the saving of Western civilization. And suddenly Christianity now is all popular again, right? The Judeo-Christian civilization, this is what we have to save. But one thing I've noticed, Mondo, so you get people like Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray and, you know, a lot of voices. We just had he did an art conference here, you know, the Alliance of Responsible Citizenship in London, £1,400 a pop to attend.
Wow.
I know, prophecy watchers, you're cheap. And I noticed this trend, this conversation about now suddenly Judeo-Christian civilization. This is what we have to save. It's popular now to be, you know, to be Christian. But of course, I've noticed that none of them actually want to go to church. None of them want to repent for their sins. None of them actually, you know, do you understand? So again, it's this idea of using the argument because we feel now our civilization is under threat. But what civilization is under threat exactly? Your thoughts.
No.
Have some more on that.
You know, this goes back to, you know, as you know, I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis, and, you know, I wrote a study guide on the Screwtape Letters. But, you know, the Screwtape Letters is one of his earliest books, you know, written basically around 1941, you know, maybe started writing it a little bit earlier and in the midst of what we understand. But he described how even back then there was a goal to use Christianity use it as a launching point to establish other ends. And so in this sense, people, like you just said, that's what I see is when you think about the Judeo-Christian West, so to speak, well, that's a far different cry than a West, which is going to use Judeo-Christianity to further its own, you know, existence. Because what you said is exactly right. And we see this in America too, that you have maybe a lack of discernment for a political movement or a Christian movement, when in reality, you know, making America great again, it's a political movement, obviously. Okay, no one should apologize for that. But there's no doubt that that movement is using Christianity for its benefit. And I'm not saying there's not genuine Christians in the movement, because there is. But at the end of the day, this is the question, whether it's saving Western civilization, or in this sense, making America great, or making the Western civilization great again. Okay, how do we define great? In the Bible, it's defined by repentance. It's defined by a pursuit of forgiveness and the fruit of the Spirit, walking in the Spirit, putting God first, but ultimately holiness and sin, right? And so I think what we've seen is the abuse or the leveraging of Christianity to help those ends. Because again, if you ask anybody in that movement, they would hope, oh, well, greatness, again, is Trump defining, this isn't a criticism of Trump necessarily. It's just, how is he defining great? Well, I think he's defining it as energy independence, you know, economic prosperity, you know, the Constitution itself being honored. Well, those are all wonderful things, but that's not the same as, again, all those things could be true, and yet America could be filled with unregenerate sinners who have no desire to repent before a holy God as it relates to the gospel. So again, as long as we keep that level of distinction, that whether it's saving Western civilization from what, this isn't a spiritual salvation. It's a political salvation. But and again, ultimately, what do we know? Well, I'd rather have an economic America than a poverty. I'd rather have freedoms that, of course, because as we know, that allows for freedom of presenting the gospel versus the previous 4 years where we had a lot of censorship. So that's how I would weigh into it in the same thing.
Yeah.
How are we defining that?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because very often what we're doing is we're defining it as the barbarians are at the gate. Okay, so Rome, and obviously the barbarians, and I use that term just as an expression, right? I'm not just calling people barbarians, but that expression of barbarians at the gate, we use that, with maybe the migrations that coming in, bringing in different ideologies, Islam, or bringing all that in, which are not compatible with Western values. But then you question, well, now, what are Western values? And it's really interesting, because all the names that I mentioned a couple there, the only one that I know is actually a believer, I am Hirsi Ali. She was actually I think she was Somalian. She was raised a Muslim. She then became an atheist, hung around with Richard Dawkins and his ilk. And then in recent years has literally become a Christian, I think a bona fide believer. So her take, of course, is the idea of the barbarians at the gate, because she's raised in a Islamic culture, so she knows what that culture does. Fair enough. But what about the barbarians within, right? So, so yes, the idea of what exactly are we trying to save here? What are we trying to make great? Because so I was listening to, okay, so now some years back, I don't know if it's still the case. I'm assuming it is. Let's assume it is. That the greatest purveyor of pornography in the world is the United States of America.
That's still true. Yes.
Do you follow what I'm saying? So, this is freedom of expression. This is freedom of, this is what we're trying to save, this Western civilization. And from where I am, look, Western civilization is completely bankrupt now. I didn't even know. I was listening to a Dennis Prager. You know Dennis Prager? I'm going to mention some names. So, very conservative. And there is now apparently there is child AI pornography, apparently, right? Okay, so real children are not involved. But there was a conversation, I listened to it yesterday, and he was saying in Judaism, there is no sin of intent. There is no sin of the heart, like in Christianity, where Jesus said, if you've committed adultery in your heart. So a man can have whatever fantasies he wants. We don't condemn that. We have nothing to do with that. And the guy he was talking with said, well, yeah, but the fact that you're entertaining it, not with real children, but with virtual children, is evil. No, we don't call that evil. So I don't know what they're trying to defend. And so, and then you have, the other lady, you'll know who I'm talking about. The Christ is King, that's her thing about Christ is King. She's conservative. She's a Catholic now, but she's, I was listening to her. She's talking about, but yet, adding your voice to people like Andrew Tate. The vilest of we're all the vilest of sinners, don't get me wrong, but in terms of, he's in the news again now for his, what he was going on with his ex-girlfriend. She's pressing charges now. So in other words, what are we trying to save? What are we trying to make great again? Or are we actually saying, this thing is over. This thing is as bankrupt as it can be. The window that we have left, as much as we've had, the civilized, and I'm a fan of America, right? That Jesus isn't going to put up with this anymore. It's just God isn't going to put up with it anymore. So this great civilization, we could say Western civilization is the greatest civilization that that has arisen on earth. But, you know, I think we have to realize it's got to come to an end, because the perversion is getting greater.
Well, let me ask you this, because we think about, these sins of the heart. So, yeah, okay, so maybe there's no, children being molested, which we know that's not true. That's certainly, it still exists. But like legitimizing not only abortion as a freedom, legitimizing the freedom to be perverted in your own mind through AI, or through, the coming doll revolution, the robotic doll and women and all. I mean, you having your own, wife. So we have this very, very delusional aspect of what is great. But if you look back, think about, I'll ask you this, the French Revolution, is that Western civilization? I mean, pretty atheistic, right? But is that still considered a foundation of what Western civilization needs to be saved? I mean, what do you think about that?
No, I mean, as an Englishman, of course, I'm not.
Of course.
I carry no truck with the French Revolution. But now here's something interesting, but we go back. So Thomas Payne was an atheist, right? Said derogatory things about God. So Thomas Payne it says without the sword of Washington, without the pen of Payne, the sword of Washington would be wielded in vain. So Thomas Payne was actually the herald, as it were, for the colonists in their separatist movement against the crown. You know what I figured out, Mondo? We all live in a contradiction. We all live in I call it the great contradiction. And my thing is, where am I in this great contradiction in my own life? So again, I'll come back to this, but again, the whole, the idea of Christ is king, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But I hope we realize that as believers, Mondo, we gave up that freedom. When we became followers of Jesus, or Jesus used his freedom, I only say those things I hear my Father say, I speak those things I see, I do those things I hear and see him do, that we commit to saying what he says, that our words are seasoned with grace and with all of, kindness. And that I just, you watch, even with your previous president, Mondo, you watch the vitriol from Christians directed against President Biden, and you're thinking, okay, but like I say, you can get caught up in a movement, the MAGA movement, let's say. But actually, if Christ is king over this, then you bring this to bear, to speak grace. It doesn't mean you can't dissent, doesn't mean that. But it means every word that you say is measured. You can't throw yourself into the free speech free-for-all that seems to be going on about we want the right to express ourselves any way we want to, because we gave up that right to express ourselves any way we want to. Hopefully we did. Yeah. So so what's interesting, so Payne, so he manages to foment the American Revolution, but the Americans really never. Again, what the historian that I thought was listen to, it was only half a revolution, because all the Americans did was they took the system of governance, commons, lords, crown, and just created a tripart system and dressed it up in Roman dress. It was only ever really half a revolution. The French Revolution, they got away with all of it. They and of course it was Thomas Paine then. He was expelled for treason here. That he died in Paris in the end, I think, alone. And even the Americans reject. He couldn't find any, even though he was kind of the voice behind the American Revolution, he couldn't find any compassion, so many years on, because he then advocated for the French Revolution, the overthrow of the monarchy, the overthrow of the crown. And interesting, it's people like Edmund Burke, who was for the colonists in America, railed against Thomas Paine. So what I'm trying to say with all that, I don't know why we go on to that, but it's all a bit deeper than people think, and we're living in this great contradiction. Yeah, getting back to this idea of Western civilization. So, okay, get on to a favorite topic of we haven't really spoken about, but L.A. Marzulli, ETs, right, and the whole extraterrestrial thing which is going on, and the hybrid one. Well, it's not the Muslims who are doing that. If I'm saying it's quite possibly the American military that's doing, and I've got a different take on that from what the traditional line is. So if all these threats are emerging, it's not just the barbarians at the gates, it's the barbarians within the gates as well, our own civilization. And so this idea of, I'm glad you brought up Lewis. I didn't know you said that. I'm not a Lewis reader, so you are. So the idea that they would use Christianity to sort of
further their own cause.
to push an agenda. And like somebody says, you're complaining about Islam and the Muslims or what have you. So I'll see you all in church on Sunday then. But they're not. And certainly not here, they're not. There's more people in church in your country than there are in mine. Do you want to say anything?
No, I would say that this whole idea, we have to be careful because we can be unaware. I have it in my brain because seeing it again in Lewis's writings, and it was happening back then, but it happens, you can use Christianity for any sort of cause. And that's what I'm seeing here is there is an enthusiasm for economic prosperity and freedom of speech, especially because what we saw during the COVID time, lockdowns and freedom, liberties being removed, and certainly censorship with all in social media, etc. So there's no doubt I'm rejoicing in many of the things that are being done at the moment, and trying also to keep in mind that God is called, Jesus's kingdom is not MAGA. Okay, it transcends beyond all that, and we always have to make that keep that in our minds, that at the end of the day, no matter what, we're called to preach the gospel. And again, when we think about that, again, greatness to God is defined as the gospel. Jesus died for sinners. He was buried. He was raised the third day to save sinners, that the gospel would go out and repentance and faith would be preached for the forgiveness of sins. So that is the ultimate message that as Christians we have. And so we have to be careful that when we look at any movement in our own minds too, are we enjoying this? Are we getting sucked into our energies being given to support a movement that isn't necessarily, it's not overtly Christian because it's not defining greatness as sin. So
yeah,
that's the distinction. And so I think for us, as we're, I guess we can kind of wrap it up here, but as we come to a close, as you're looking out, and you're watching all this, any final thoughts in this whole discussion?
Well, I think we have to realize the sands of time are running out. I know like President Trump talked about a new golden age of America. Well, for an age, you need some years. I think we don't have considerable years of an age. But what I would say, listen, the reason in my nation that we gave birth to the Industrial Revolution and gave birth to the modern world and all of that and all, is because we were the greatest Protestant missionary sending nation on earth at the time. So there is a connection there, right? And then, of course, that baton has passed to you guys now. So you pick up the mantle, and you're now the greatest economic and military power on earth, like we were. So all this stuff has to come to an end. We can't be drawn into stuff. And I was listening to a podcast. I've only got a couple of minutes at Mondo, but this is really interesting because the historians were saying that the first city ever, the first city in world history is a city called Uruk. It was raised. I mean, I've got all these notes. I was hoping we could talk about Uruk. The whole idea of Uruk 5,000 years ago they had these two great temples, of Iana, the House of Heaven. Maybe we should talk about this another time. Maybe we can have a second part of this conversation. How about that?
Yeah,
but it's the idea that what began in Uruk has to come to an end. And it comes to an end there in the book of Revelation, because Uruk, of course, from the biblical narrative, is a city founded by Nimrod, and of course, his was the city of Babylon, and, they left off building the city, so he goes to build these other cities. But Uruk is an amazing, from a historical, archaeological point of view. If you listen to that podcast, I think you'll find it really interesting. But again, I think we have to be aware that, what began all those years ago, that the cities that began in the sands of the mud flats of Mesopotamia in 5000 BC, we've now reaching the end of this iteration of human civilization. And our nations are going to be judged. And that great prophecy in Micah and in Isaiah, where he will judge amongst the nations and he will solve disputes amongst the nations. They will learn war no more. This is really what we have to look for and set our hopes on. And so in this final great push, whatever this window is, Mondo, of some years, and I actually believe there will be we have to have some sort of revival. Some people don't believe that. I think we have a window of revival, of renewal, of picking up the remnant, and where Jesus will then come to establish his rule and reign on earth. And we won't have all of this mixture. We won't have this good with the bad. We will truly have a Christian, messianic, Judeo-Christian civilization in its truest form. Is it G.K. Chesterton who said that, it's not that Christianity hasn't been tried, it's that it hasn't succeeded, it's that it hasn't been tried. True Christian civilization. So maybe that's a positive note to end our discussion on.
Because that really is the key, is that all of us look forward to the Lord's return, where he not only will have the wisdom, the character, the love, the righteousness for sure, but he'll have the power to institute and rule with a rod of iron. I mean, that's really the goal, and that's going to be the true golden kingdom age. But even there, we'll see that sin is still hanging out in the periphery, and that'll one day be rectified. Graham, as always, great talking to you. Great, and we look forward to seeing you here in 6 months or so for sure. And we'll be back for another podcast. But just want to remind everybody again, we're going to be going to England, Norway, and Germany. If you want information on that, go to prophecywatchers.com and just look at the events tab. Scroll down, you can see we'll be there in August and September. And it'll be a great time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yep. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll catch you next time.
10 years ago, we began an exciting journey, a mission dedicated to spreading the good news of the soon return of Jesus. Our passion for teaching Bible prophecy is what drives us to warn the world of events that are soon to come. In the last 2 years, tens of thousands of prophecy watchers from all over the world have subscribed to our monthly magazine, The Prophecy Watcher. Our first Too Good to Be True offer came with 8 bonus DVDs. Our second offer came with 10 bonus DVDs. But our 10-year anniversary offer is even better. 12 DVDs on Bible prophecy can be yours when you subscribe to our 48-page full-color magazine for just 1 year, print or digital format, all for a gift of $50, with shipping included in the USA. Care to become a fellow prophecy watcher? Just call the toll-free number on your screen or visit our online bookstore at prophecywatchers.com. Partner with us today and help us take the message of the soon return of Jesus to the whole world.